A hood comes down over a man's face mid-sentence. He's talking about honor, about his fatherland, about serving a cause the way better men served before him, and the executioner does not wait for him to finish. Behind him, in the same prison courtyard, 6 other men in prison uniforms are waiting their turn on 2 black gallows built specifically for this morning, each one alone with whatever he still believes about what he did. 10 months earlier, every one of them had stood in a converted courtroom in Nuremberg and heard a tribunal read the word death next to their names, one after another, for crimes committed not with rifles or gas chambers built by someone else, but with scalpels, syringes, and medical degrees. What did they say when that sentence finally arrived, in person, at their own necks? The tribunal at Nuremberg's Palace of Justice had spent more than 8 months on this case alone. Not soldiers, not camp commandants, but physicians. 23 defendants, 20 of them doctors, 3 of them the administrators, who made the doctors' work possible. Brigadier General Telford Taylor opened the prosecution's case by telling the court plainly what it was about to hear. The defendants in this case are charged with murders, tortures, and other atrocities committed in the name of medical science. He introduced a word coined specifically for what the evidence would show, thanatology, the science of producing death, and reminded the judges that every one of the men in the dock had once sworn the Hippocratic Oath's most basic promise, to do no harm. The victims of these crimes are numbered in the hundreds of thousands, Taylor said. They came in wholesale lots and were treated worse than animals. On the 20th of August, 1947, after months of testimony from survivors and from the doctor's own documents, presiding Judge Walter B. Beals read the tribunal's verdict aloud, defendant by defendant, in the same courtroom where the evidence had been laid out for the better part of a year. 7 acquitted, 4 sentenced to prison terms of 10 to 20 years, 5 sentenced to life, and 7 sentenced to hang. This was the trial that gave the world its first formal code of medical ethics for human experimentation, written directly into the judge's verdict as a response to what they had just heard. That legacy is well known today, cited in research protocols on every continent. What happened to the 7 men standing at the center of it, in the 10 months between the verdict and the rope, is not. The 7 Karl Brandt was the name at the top of the indictment, and for good reason. Born in Mühlhausen in Alsace, the son of a Prussian army officer, he earned his medical degree and qualified as a surgeon specializing in head and spinal injuries in 1928, a serious, capable physician years before politics entered his life. He met Hitler in the summer of 1932, joined the Nazi Party that same year, and by August of 1934 had become Hitler's personal escort physician, a title that placed him permanently inside the dictator's circle. From there, his authority only grew. In September of 1939, Hitler named him co-director of the euthanasia program, later known by its internal code name, Action T4, responsible for the killing of tens of thousands of German patients with disabilities and chronic illness. And by 1942, he held the title Reich Commissioner for Health and Sanitation, sitting at the administrative center of the machinery that later supplied both personnel and method to the death camps in the East. In the courtroom, Brandt did not deny his authority. He defended it. Karl Gebhardt had trained as a surgeon in Munich in the years before the Nazi Party ever existed, built a respected reputation in orthopedic medicine, and by the war's later years had risen to become Heinrich Himmler's personal physician, and, eventually, president of the German Red Cross, the same institution the world associates with battlefield mercy and neutral aid. That title sat uneasily beside what the tribunal proved he had ordered done to a group of young Polish women held at Ravensbrück. Gebhardt had them cut open, infected, and operated on without anesthesia to simulate battlefield wounds, testing sulfonamide drugs on injuries he manufactured himself. The survivors of those operations, who came to be known among themselves and later to the world as the Rabbits, would spend the rest of their lives walking on legs Gebhardt had deliberately ruined. Waldemar Hoven had been chief doctor at Buchenwald, a position from which, according to testimony at trial, he injected phenol directly into the hearts of prisoners marked for death. Somewhere between 90 and 100 people killed this way in a single week, week after week, for well over a year. He had also used the camp's population as subjects for typhus experiments run under his own supervision, a doctor turned into an instrument of the very disease he was supposed to treat. In a detail, the tribunal noted, with something close to irony, Hoven's own SS superiors had arrested him in the autumn of 1943, accused of injecting a fellow SS officer with a lethal dose of the same poison he used on prisoners. He was released a year and a half later only because the camp system was short on doctors, and put straight back to work. Joachim Rogowski held the title of chief hygienist for the SS and the German police, and it was his signature and his instructions behind typhus and other infectious disease experiments carried out on prisoners at Sachsenhausen and Buchenwald, deliberately infecting healthy people to study a disease that was, at that moment, already killing thousands of prisoners involuntarily in the same camps without anyone's consent. Wolfram Sievers ran the research institute of the Unethical, the SS's pseudoscientific think tank founded to manufacture academic cover for Nazi racial ideology. And it was Sievers who arranged for the murder of more than 100 concentration camp prisoners for the sole purpose of adding their skeletons to an anatomical collection meant to prove theories of racial inferiority. Journalists who covered the trial would later call him, half in disbelief, the Nazi Bluebeard. A librarian and archivist by training, running a killing operation with the paperwork and patience of a museum acquisitions department rather than the language of a crime. Victor Brack had no medical degree at all. He was a senior administrator in Hitler's own chancellery, and it was Brack who helped design and run the killing centers of the euthanasia program, the same program Brandt oversaw, before personally proposing that its gas chamber method be extended to the mass killing of Jewish people in the East. In court, Brack insisted the euthanasia killings had been an act of mercy for the incurably ill. Rudolf Brandt, no relation to Karl, was Himmler's personal administrative officer, the man who processed the paperwork that authorized camp experiments and carried out Himmler's orders in writing. The tribunal found that his signature, not a scalpel, made him as responsible as the men who held the syringes. 7 very different roles inside the same machine. One who commanded it, several who staffed its laboratories, one who ran its ideological cover, and 2 who ran its paperwork and its funding. The tribunal treated all 7 as equally guilty of the same underlying crime, and none of their defenses, orders followed, mercy intended, science pursued in the name of the German people, moved the judges toward anything softer than a rope. What remained after the verdict was only the waiting. 10 months. A death sentence at Nuremberg was not carried out the next morning. Under the rules governing the American zone of occupation, every death sentence from the subsequent Nuremberg trials had to pass one more review before it could be carried out. Appeals were filed. Petitions for clemency went up the American chain of command, arguing variously that the men had been following orders, that their scientific expertise was too valuable to waste, that the evidence had been misread or exaggerated. General Lucius D. Clay, the military governor with final authority over every sentence handed down in the American occupation zone, reviewed each case individually, not as a formality, but case by case, file by file. Clergy and medical professionals wrote on Karl Brandt's behalf specifically, asking for his life to be spared on the grounds of his medical service to ordinary German civilians during the war. Clay rejected the plea, writing that he could find no basis for clemency given Brandt's direct responsibility for much of the suffering and death caused to the unfortunate concentration camp victims. One by one, the same conclusion was reached for the other 6. Not a single one of the 7 death sentences from the doctor's trial was commuted. The 7 were transferred to Landsberg prison in Bavaria, a name that already carried its own dark irony. It was in a cell in this same building, more than 2 decades earlier, that Adolf Hitler had spent the months after the failed beer hall putsch, dictating the book that would become Mein Kampf. Now it held condemned killers of an entirely different kind, in a facility the American Army had renamed War Criminal Prison No. 1. For 10 months, the 7 men lived within a few hundred meters of each other, each one alone with whatever certainty or denial he had carried out of the courtroom. Then, on the 2nd of June, 1948, 2 black gallows were built in the prison courtyard, and the waiting ended. June the 2nd. They were taken out of their cells, one at a time, walked the short distance across the courtyard, and made to climb the steps to one of the 2 waiting platforms. What survives from that morning is fragmentary. Not a full transcript, but the handful of final statements guards and witnesses thought worth recording, filtered through decades of retelling and, in places, contradicted by other accounts of the same hour. Where the record is uncertain, this account says so rather than filling the gap with invention. Karl Brandt used his moment to make a speech. He began talking about honor, insisting there was no shame in standing where he stood, that he had served his fatherland the way other men had served theirs before him. And he was still talking when the black hood came down over his face, cutting the sentence off before he reached its end. It was the closest thing to a complete final statement any of the 7 managed. And even his was interrupted mid-word. Karl Gebhardt, the surgeon who had cut open the women of Ravensbrück, spoke only a single line, that he died without bitterness, but with regret that there was still injustice in the world. Not injustice done to the women whose legs he had ruined, injustice, in his own account, done to him. Joachim Rogowski went further than regret. He told those present that he died as a German officer, condemned by what he called a brutal enemy, and that he remained conscious of never having committed the crimes laid against him. A flat denial, at the very last possible moment, of infections a tribunal had already spent months proving he ordered. Victor Brack, the bureaucrat who had helped design the gas chambers of the euthanasia program before proposing the same method for the death camps, asked only that God grant peace to the world, the last words of a man who had told the court. Under oath, that killing the incurably ill was itself an act of mercy. Of Waldemar Hoven, of Wolfram Sievers, and of Rudolf Brandt, no final words survive in the historical record accessible today. Whether they said nothing or said something no one thought worth writing down is not something this account can answer, and it will not be invented here. What is documented instead is smaller and in its own way stranger. Rudolf Brandt, Himmler's administrator, was hanged on his 39th birthday. 4 men who used their last breath to deny, minimize, or recast what they had done. 3 men whose last words, if they had any, disappeared along with them. Not one of the 7 is recorded as having spoken the name of a single person harmed by what he did. Would a single acknowledgement from any of them, one name, one apology, spoken instead of a denial, have changed anything about how history remembers this morning? Or was the silence itself the final piece of evidence the tribunal never got to hear? Unmarked. The bodies of the 7 were not returned to their families as heroes' remains, and most were never claimed at all. They were buried, along with hundreds of other men executed at Landsberg. Over the years, the prison operated under American control, in unmarked graves in the small cemetery beside the Sputtingen Chapel, just outside the prison walls. The nameplates that once marked individual graves there were later removed. Today, the site holds roughly 300 burials with no way, standing among them, to tell one convicted killer's grave from another's. In the same small Bavarian town where the man who made their crimes possible once sat in a cell writing his own book about the future he intended to build. Gebhardt himself never lived to see it, but the women he operated on did not disappear into history the way he assumed they would. More than a decade after his execution, an American woman named Caroline Faraday learned their stories through a French resistance survivors organization and, working with a former Nuremberg prosecutor, arranged for dozens of the surviving rabbits to travel to the United States for the reconstructive treatment their own government had never offered them. They stayed with host families, were honored in a luncheon at the United States Congress, and eventually secured an admission of responsibility and funding for their care from the West German government, a form of justice Gebhardt's silence at the gallows never once gestured toward. The trial that ended in that courtyard also produced something that outlived every one of the 7 men, a formal 10-point standard for ethical human experimentation, still cited in medical research today, still known by the name of the city where it was written. Its very first line reads, in full, "The voluntary consent of the human subject is absolutely essential." A single sentence the 7 men on the gallows had never once applied to a single person in their care. The same proceeding that could not extract one genuine word of remorse from the men it convicted left behind the rulebook, meant to make sure no one could do what they did again without a name, a victim, and a reckoning attached to it.